Welcome to today's webinar, organised by the High-Level Panel for a Sustainable Ocean Economy, which I'll refer to as the Ocean Panel, and the IUCN Tourism and Protected Areas Specialist Group, or TAPAS Group. Today, we are featuring the findings of a report commissioned by the Ocean Panel that's accompanied by over 40 perspectives from sustainable tourism experts globally, including from business, industry, international organisations, and pre-eminent academics, many of whom are joining us today. For those of you who haven't joined us before, I will provide a brief overview. Established in September 2018, the Ocean Panel is made up of 17 serving world leaders, co-chaired by the Prime Minister of Norway and the President of Palau. As you can see from the map, the Ocean Panel comprises members from across the world and is supported by the UN Secretary-General's Special Envoy for the Oceans. It's the only ocean policy body made up of serving world leaders with the authority needed to trigger, amplify, and accelerate action worldwide for ocean priorities. The Ocean Panel aims to facilitate a better and more resilient future for people and the planet. The goal of the Ocean Panel is to deliver a sustainable ocean economy where effective protection, sustainable production, and equitable prosperity go hand in hand. The Ocean Panel has been working to achieve key objectives that include enhancing humanity's relationship with the ocean, bridging ocean health and wealth, working with diverse stakeholders, harnessing the latest ocean knowledge, and developing an action agenda for transitioning to a sustainable ocean economy. To briefly introduce myself, I served as one of the lead authors of the Ocean Panel report, and I'm the chair of the IUCN's World Commission on Protected Areas, Tourism and Protected Areas Specialist Group, or the TAPAS Group. This group provides a platform for protected area practitioners and volunteers to share expertise and knowledge, raise sustainability awareness, and foster innovative solutions. I have other hats too, and sit on the Global Sustainable Tourism Council's Board of Directors, and also the Independent Advisory Group of Travelist. My day job, which I do in between these voluntary efforts, is as an independent consultant, working on sustainable tourism for development agencies, governments, the private sector, and NGOs. Before we start the substance of the webinar, I'd like to mention a few housekeeping items. We welcome engagement throughout the webinar on Twitter, and the hashtags to use will be available in the chat box throughout the webinar. Today's report and the series of expert perspectives, along with other knowledge products commissioned by the Ocean Panel, are all available on the Ocean Panel website, and the link will also be provided in the chat box. This event is being recorded, and the link will be shared with everyone who's participating today. We encourage you to post your questions for the Q&A session in the question and answer box located at the bottom of your screen. And please indicate with your question which panelist you would like to have respond. This webinar is one in a series and will be followed by a corresponding webinar for the Europe, North America, and Africa time zones later today. So with that, I'll now hand over to Eliza Northrup to present high-level findings from the report and the associated expert perspectives. Eliza is a director for the Sustainable Development Reform Hub at the University of New South Wales. She's an experienced international environmental lawyer, specializing in climate change and ocean governance. She led global policy for the Ocean Panel and World Resources Institute prior to her role at the University of New South Wales. Welcome, Eliza.
Thanks so much, Anna, and thank you for everyone for joining us today. So I'm going to start off sort of presenting the report by presenting a little bit of the framing of how the Ocean Panel got to the point of commissioning this special report and series of expert perspectives. So in 2019, the Ocean Panel launched a politically endorsed roadmap for a sustainable ocean economy called the Transformations for a Sustainable Ocean Economy, with goals and commitments and action priorities across the entire ocean economy. One of these was a 2030 goal focused on the sustainability of coastal and marine tourism, and that's what's on the screen at the moment. This goal is incredibly ambitious, and to deliver on this vision, destinations, communities, countries really need to overcome some of the current sustainability challenges facing the sector, adapt quite quickly to the new challenges presented by climate change, biodiversity loss, evolving consumer preferences, and most recently what we've seen through the pandemic is these sort of unexpected crises that really shake the industry and cause tremendous economic loss to those countries and communities that rely on it. So this transformation that's required to achieve this goal or any sort of ambitious 2030 sustainability goal for the sector will require widespread recognition of the underlying systemic causes of the current fragility of the sector, recognition of how to manage the growing demand for tourism, whilst also improving sustainability, starting to phase out some of the practices that are no longer really fit for the future, understanding what we know, what is to come, implementation of new practices across the entire tourism value chain, really bringing together all the different stakeholders involved in that value chain, and creating sort of new business models, new public-private partnerships that are really focused on delivering the sustainable tourism experience. Numerous examples of innovation and leadership exist, many of which have emerged over the last couple of years. And this was really sort of the framing or this challenge, I suppose, that the special report that we worked on was seeking to fill and provide a bit of a narrative, a commentary, and bring to life some of the examples that can serve as inspiration for others. So the report itself was commissioned by a team of experts within the tourism space, Anna and many others part of that group. But we also, in parallel to this report, commissioned a series of over 40 sort of expert perspectives, really diving into some of the more emerging questions that are facing the industry. And all of these are also available on the Ocean Panel website. So combined with the report, which I'm focusing on, there is also this tremendous wealth of information and expert opinions and perspectives from small industry players, from really large hotel and resort chains, right through to academics and international organizations as well. So I would encourage you to have a look on the Ocean Panel website for that one. So just take a step back, and hopefully this isn't a surprise to anyone joining this webinar. Tourism is absolutely critical when you look at the ocean economy. I think analysis undertaken in 2021, which is on the screen at the moment, put it essentially the largest sector within the ocean economy. And for many countries, particularly small island developing states, it is the biggest contributor to their GDP. It's incredibly important that we get the future development of this sector right, and that we're being very aware of what's coming down the pike in terms of challenges as well as opportunities for the sector. I'll touch on this briefly in a sec. But at least when we started this report, there was relatively little about the size of the actual coastal and marine tourism sector, a lot on the tourism sector and the importance globally, but very much we then sort of looked at this coastal and marine, the subsector, I suppose, within the broader tourism sector. So analysis that we did, or members of our author team did, for the report estimates that a very conservative estimate is that coastal and marine tourism, and coastal, I suppose, being anything very adjacent to the coast, represents at the very least 50% and probably much higher. So even when we're talking about the sustainability of the tourism sector in general, having a real focus on the unique characteristics, the unique vulnerabilities, the unique opportunities of that coastal and marine tourism sector is incredibly important to the transition of the entire sector. And obviously, all of our members on the Ocean Panel that are all large ocean states. So to, again, sort of picking up some of what I mentioned earlier, to understand some of the challenges facing the industry and why there is a need to change, not just a desire to become more sustainable, but really a lot of these pressures that meant that's where the long-term economic viability would be. We analysed 6 global trends, those are on the screen at the moment, and really unpacked the opportunities presented by those trends. For example, looking at the shifting demand and travel preferences, what opportunities did that present for coastal and marine tourism in particular, based on a lot of the recent surveys that have been carried out post-pandemic of what tourists are now looking for, but also what challenges does that mean for many of their very established tourism operators and practices. So we did that for each of those 6 global trends to really build up a picture of what the future of this sector looked like, and the considerations that governments, that the private sector and sort of destination management authorities really needed to start thinking about now. Emerging out of that analysis and so the reflection within the author team, we sort of came up with this very simple framework that focused on the need to sort of move beyond just reducing the impacts of tourism, which historically has been a really big focus of the sustainability agenda, and really focusing on bringing in a much greater emphasis on regeneration and building resilience. And not just resilience to climate change, which is incredibly important, but resilience to future shocks as well, and changes in many of those challenges that I just mentioned. And then for each of these, making sure that we had a really strong focus on what that meant sort of environmentally, economically, and socially and culturally. Again, so making sure that we were resilient, building resilient tourism for the local communities and for the local culture that was, had a very long-term strategy in place to maintain that local culture. Same for sort of the economic as well as the environmental aspects that we often hear quite a bit about. So a couple of key takeaways before getting into a couple of sort of the more detailed aspects of the report, and much of this has come out from what I've already said. It is such a significant economic sector. If we get it right, if we can effectively sort of transform the coastal and marine tourism sector, it really provides the foundation for a sustainable ocean economy, and that, at least from the Ocean Panel's perspective, is really their goal. So if we get this sector right, we can start to see sort of a lot of the other aspects unpack. So incredibly important to focus on this transition. I mentioned earlier that there's a lot of examples out there that are very inspiring, but they're not happening on the scale needed to drive systemic change, which is what is really necessary within this industry. We need to find ways to either replicate them across geographies, across regions, or scale them up within governments. The report, we talk a lot about the role of governments, destination management authorities, the private sector, but we also identify that for this change to happen, tourists must be themselves agents of change. There's increasing studies, as others may speak to, that travellers are demanding sustainable tourism options that align with their values. We have to be able to tap into that and accelerate that sort of preference. And I'll speak to a couple of the examples of Palau, at least in later slides, as to how they're sort of tapping in to the concept of tourists being agents of change. And GDP alone is an insufficient indicator for the long-term viability of the sector. So the report really tries to aggregate some of the leading sets of indicators for sustainability, not to duplicate or replace them, but really to sort of add a few more, focusing on those regeneration and resilience elements that I mentioned earlier, to provide a more comprehensive set of indicators to truly map the sustainability of the sector. And sort of final very important point that again has been talked about a lot is we are at a really crucial juncture as a result of the global pandemic. We have been reopening, doing things differently. So now, again, the time is really right to bring in some of these changes that many people have been talking about for a long time. So I mentioned that we had proposed new indicators, just to give a snapshot from the report as to how detailed we go with that. This is a lot of the environmental indicators. We do the same for economic and social cultural. So those in bold sort of provide a fair degree of sort of baseline data, and the non-bolded indicators are sort of where some destinations or operators may want to go a little bit further depending on their particular needs. So that's all in the report. because, and coming back to this point of the importance of measuring the sustainability of tourism, there is a great amount of support. The UNWTO Measuring the Sustainability of Tourism project, recognised by the UN Statistical Commission, really provides a lot of tools and guidance for using accounts frameworks and other indicators to try to measure the contribution of tourism to the Sustainable Development Goals and broader sustainability objectives. And all of this is costly. Transformation requires investment. Can we afford this transition? Can we afford not to transition? We have a very big section in the report sort of outlining many of these sort of financing mechanisms. Some of them have been around for a long time, some of them a little bit more innovative, and really unpacking a lot of the economic analysis on their sort of viability and how they can best be deployed. And now sort of very quickly, just 4 sort of snapshots, examples of some of the case studies that we've got in the report that illustrate some of the different points that I've been making. The first one's Palau, which is, again, that point of positioning tourists as agents of change. They were the first country to change its immigration laws and put sort of environmental protection at its core. Tourists sign a pledge on arrival, nearly 800,000 pledges so far. And then that links into business certification for tourists while they're there. And more recently, the Olau Palau initiative, that's really using technology to tap into and incentivize a change in behaviour and unlock a different tourist experiences depending on the sustainability footprint of tourism. So the more you can do, the more sustainable you are, the more opportunities you get to interact with unique cultural sites or ecosystems with the island. So incredibly innovative to see how they're sort of using technology and tourists to change things. Barbados is a point around some of the resilience aspects and the diversification aspects, which came through very strongly in the report, the need to diversify in order to build resilience. A very simple example about the use of multi-use infrastructure, building climate change resilience, while also offering additional tourism attractions on the island. Next is New Zealand, how they built a more diversified and unique tourism offering through really focusing on their unique cultural aspects and working with the local Maori community to sort of build that into a new strategy that has paid dividends in terms of increasing visitors and sort of financial retention within the area. So amazing example of sort of using place DNA or creating place DNA within the Bay of Plenty in New Zealand. And very quickly, lastly, Bonaire, which is one of the few sort of marine protected areas that's almost entirely financed by user fees, sort of disconnected to traditional government financing models, and a really interesting development over many, many years as to how they did a lot of economic analysis to identify the right level of user fees. And that has then been replicated in many other places. Almost done. Last sort of 5 priorities that we identify. I won't read through them. They're all available there on the screen. But I think another key takeaway, there is no single set of recommendations that will apply. Unfortunately, there's no single roadmap that if we just follow steps 1 to 5, we will improve the sustainability of the industry. But there are sort of these priorities that are relevant regardless of location or size of the sector, that can really help initiate destination-wide systemic change as part of recovery efforts. And I will stop there and hand back to you, Anna. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Eliza. Thank you for sharing these really important learnings and the inspiring case studies and those key priorities moving forward. Thank you. We'll now move straight on to the panel discussions. So we're going to have about an hour for this part of the session with questions for each of our distinguished panelists, and then we'll have some overarching questions that the whole panel can respond to. So we'll start with a question for each of our panelists in turn. And when I come to you, if I can ask each panelist to please turn on your camera and mic when we speak. So just to note, His Excellency Dr. Prasad was due to join our panel today from Fiji, but unfortunately he's been unable to join us due to a family emergency. So we wish him very well. And therefore I'd like to welcome His Excellency Dr. Arif Havas Ogroseno, who is Sous Sherpa to the President of Indonesia for the Ocean Panel and Indonesian Ambassador to Germany. Ambassador Agrosono has extensive experience in Indonesia's coastal and marine sectors and international foreign policy. He served as Deputy Coordinating Minister for Maritime Sovereignty Affairs at the Coordinating Ministry for Maritime Affairs in the Republic of Indonesia. He was the President of the 20th meeting of state parties to the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, the Director General for Law and International Treaties of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and the Indonesian ambassador to Belgium, Luxembourg, and the European Union from 2010 to 2015. Most recently, the ambassador has taken a leading role in the development of Indonesian ocean policy. Ambassador Agrosono, if I could invite you to put your video on. In fact, if all the panelists could put their videos on, please, and unmute your mic. Wonderful, thank you. So, Ambassador, I would like to ask you, please. Indonesia has innovated in its recovery to tourists post-pandemic, offering tourism products that are smaller, tailored, personalized, and localized. Could you please speak to the creation of tourism villages, thematic villages, and creative cities in coastal areas, and how these offerings are continuing to support both the tourism recovery in Indonesia and also efforts to improve sustainability? Thank you.
Thank you very much. First of all, let me just say I'm glad to be part of the discussion today. And I want to go back a little bit in the early 2000s when we had the very unfortunate Bali bombing. And that was a shock for us in terms of tourism. So Bali bombing in the heart of Bali. And that realized us that we need to change the approach of our tourism in Bali. So we had this understanding that tourism is very, very fragile to external factors, not only in the pandemic situations like what we have just experienced 2 years ago. And we had the pandemic, of course, and we further realized that although the tourism is a very important aspect in terms of GDP, in terms of global Indonesian economy itself, but if you don't go to the villages, then it's not going to do any trickle-down effect whatsoever. And 2014, Indonesian government organized a new program of providing funding of every village in Indonesia of $100,000. So it's not so much, but $100,000 for a village is a lot of money. And we tested them, and 80% are successful, 20 not successful, and we are working on the counseling on the 20%. And during the pandemic and post-pandemic, we realized that this funding can also be utilized, in terms of tourism, and therefore the idea of having the tourism village came about. And currently we have 3,400 tourism villages across Indonesia. What are these tourism villages? It's a tourism that's developed by the local community, ownership by the local community, and it has to follow the standard cleanliness, health, safety, environmental sustainability, and there are other elements like natural beauty, environment, and we, the government, give them training, give them advertisement, invite minister and presidents to come to the places, and we have what we call the Tourism Village Award. So they are competing. And because they are competing, they are then trying to be better among themselves. So 2021, we created what we call the guideline on tourism villages. And the idea is to take it to the next level, and we bring a number of university, private sectors to assist them in the training, in the communication skill, and all those different aspects of that. So I think the previous presentation showed that GDP is not the only thing, which is true. So GDP is, of course, important to see the global numbers. But if you go to these different little spots in the villages, then I think you will make a lot of, impact. And each village, of course, has their own uniqueness, their own beauty, their own themes. So that's why we have thematic villages. So in some area, the theme is the rice paddy. In the other area, the theme will be waterfall. In the other area will be culture. The other area will be crafts. Other will be culinary. And it is actually the culinary part. It's a mind blowing. People go to small villages and they go to enjoy a really good food. My personal experience outside of Jogja, far away from Jogja, 15 kilometers in the middle of nowhere, we have this family, the government support, who runs the restaurants, and buses are coming, and then it creates income for the parking, income for this and that. So this is the thing that we develop. So that's how we approach it. There's of course the regulatory framework. There's of course the funding, as you mentioned before, the financing. But I think if you look this model very carefully, it is not that expensive, to go into these villages. And if they start to have the sense of belonging and ownership, they are willing to put their own money and they're willing to work harder. So far it was quite successful. 3 years, 3,400 villages, not bad. Thank you.
Thank you. I would say that was much better than not bad. I think that's very impressive. I really look forward to trying those culinary mind-blowing experiences one day. It sounds really amazing. So congratulations on those efforts. Thank you very much indeed. I'd like to move on next and welcome Russell Reichelt. He is Sherpa to the Prime Minister of Australia for the Ocean Panel. Russell was chairman and chief executive of the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park Authority from 2007 until 2018. And during this period, the authority developed the Great Barrier Reef Outlook Report, which publicized scientific reports of the threats of coral bleaching and other risks of rising sea temperatures caused by greenhouse gas concentrations. He's now a board member of the Australian Climate Change Authority, and in 2018 was appointed as the Australian Sherpa representing the Prime Minister for the High-Level Panel for a Sustainable Ocean Economy, and in 2019 as Chair of New South Wales Marine Estate Management Authority. So welcome, Russell. And I would like to ask you, please, how successful has Australia's promotion of sustainable tourism operators been in areas of high marine biodiversity, for example, as in the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park World Heritage Site? And how has this changed or been enhanced post-pandemic as a form of recovery?
Well, thank you, Anna, and thank you very much for inviting me. How successful? From my point of view, I'm very biased. I love the Barrier Reef. I've worked there a long time, and before I was the management arm, I was head of the Australian Institute of Marine Science. So I've done a lot of diving and research on the Barrier Reef. So I think the success of the authority has been successful. There is only one major federal government body with the responsibility to manage the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park, which is, I think, 350,000 square kilometres, so about the size of Italy or United Kingdom. And it's 2,000 kilometres long, has about 3,000 individual reefs. So not as much coral as Indonesia, Pak Havas, but It has a strong management regime, but it didn't start that way. The first decision of the Marine Park Authority in 1977 was to make a map of the reef. So things were quite primitive. Remote sensing wasn't too functional then, but the population has been small. Even now, there's only about 1 million people living along that 2,000 kilometres. We don't have any large cities in the region, and the main uses are for shipping and transport, tourism, and also agriculture. But these have their own pressures. So what's happened over the years? At the time the authority began, there was no concept of a marine park. This was the first one. Before that, there were fish habitat reserves, and there wasn't a national parks on the land. So this is like a national park, a multiple use park in the water, which allows for sustainable use. That was a new thing in 1977. So since then, as much wonderful work been done, and the idea of making spatial area management the core of it. Scientific knowledge has been a fundamental principle. Good science is essential. And I would say tourism evolved along with the authority. There wasn't a very big tourism industry either at those times. And I would say, though, that the tourism industry's success in being an industry with some, I think it was nearly $5 billion per year, whereas fisheries was a quarter of a billion. So tourism is the biggest industry on the reef as well. And it all happens in quite managed small areas. There's about, before COVID, about 2 or 2.5 million visitors per day visits per year. But a lot of the coastal people who live along the coast also use it. So if I had to single out now of the various evolutionary steps, what are the things that is really working well for tourism? There's so many things that have happened in that time. But I think recognition and partnership with the industry has been very strong for decades. The idea of an independently audited, high eco standard for tourism operators changed the game entirely. They would be assessed as meeting the criteria for protecting the natural system, for educating the tourists, for repairing damage. These are the things that give you the high standard. But the authority was able to say, if you operate at a high standard, we will give you a longer lease on your site, which you could, if you were the financial operator, you can take that to the bank. So it's a valuable thing to get a longer lease if you're a tourist operator. So some of those ideas were built in a decade or more ago. And this has enabled accidents do happen with ships hitting reefs to restore damage. And these high standard operators, one of their measures is to contribute to the education of tourists and protect the whole system. So that's one. The second of three is that there's been a new concept called the Master Reef Guides, and working with NGOs, working with the universities, the authority and the tourist industry have worked together to improve the quality of the tourist experience. So the Master Reef Guide program is fairly new, but it is very successful. And it means that the individual companies have much better interpretive material than they would. They become attractive to the tourists. And the related program we have is that the awareness. I think in the report that Eliza said, there was one particular article by an Australian Queensland Tourism Industry Council executive, Daniel Schint, and he pointed to the three things that will change things would be valuing nature properly, understanding the status and educating the tourists and the industry, and understanding the urgency. So those three things are embedded in these couple of examples. The third one was the eye on the reef, which is information about each site, which is it's given to the authority, but we give it back to the operators, consolidated, and they can then improve their interpretive material, and they can see their contribution and show the tourists that they're part of something bigger and better coordinated. So there's three examples. Tourism is built into the DNA of the marine park. And as my friend Daniel Schwint said, looking after the environment isn't just an option for tourism. It's part of the industry's DNA. So I'll stop there. Post-pandemic, I just say on post-pandemic issues, I think if Ambassador Sachendra Prasad were here, he would be talking about the need to respond to climate change and regenerative tourism. I've met with the ambassador quite a few times now, but in Australia, it's the same thing. The industry are leading discussions, and these are not public, they're not ordered by the government, but mechanisms to decarbonise their industry and the tourist experience are in active discussion, but commercially in confidence. But the other idea is the Marine Park Authority has actually making policy about regenerative tourism and a framework for it. And it's something that's built into the Indigenous culture, which is to regenerate they look after country in Australia. The Indigenous 60,000 years of living with nature, we need to learn that experience and build that in. And the Marine Park Authority is doing that through its new program of regenerative tourism. I should say, they're going to regenerate the tourist and nature. They want the tourist to come away feeling regenerated as well, have a feeling of being a part of nature and looking after it. Thank you, Anna, back to you.
Thank you so much. Yeah, that's really fascinating. Thank you. I was particularly interested in what you said initially about the working with those operators. You get them a longer lease that then they can use with the banks to get collateral for loans. And I'm sure that'll be interesting with Wouter on our panel as well today, what he thinks about that. And I like the interaction with the operators, being able to give information and data that you get on the reef back to them. So you've got this flow of information between you. That's great. And on the issue on the decarbonisation by the tourism industry, obviously we've got Daryl here on our panel as well, Daryl Wade. So it'll be really interesting to come back to that issue with Intrepid's examples of how they've been working on it. So Russell, thank you very much indeed for your input. That was great. So now I'm very pleased that we have also Randy Durband, who's the CEO of the Global Sustainable Tourism Council. Randy has had 2 careers in travel and tourism. Firstly, with more than 20 years in senior leadership positions among some of the finest US tour operators. And secondly, Randy advanced the work of sustainable tourism as an advisor, consultant, and speaker. He brings his knowledge of the business of travel, his global network of travel professionals, and a passion for sustainability to support the GSTC and the general sustainable tourism movement. So Randy, welcome.
Thank you.
What I would like to ask you first of all, please, is how can the GSTC criteria for industry and destinations be applied to marine and ocean tourism? And do you have some examples to share of where this is being done well? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Anna. Yeah, the GSTC criteria, both destination and industry criteria, can be applied in countless ways, because with 50% of tourism being coastal, there's a lot of elements to it. So I would start by saying that the first step with the GSTC criteria that anybody can apply them with is read them, take them out into the field. They shouldn't be left in the abstract to say, oh, that's a good idea, we have them. And if you're not familiar with them, they're really the most inclusively created standards in the world for sustainable tourism. So in that sense, they provide a non-cultural, non-political view of kind of universal expression of what are the most essential elements of sustainability. So it's sort of the long definition of sustainability in travel and tourism. So again, I would say, don't just read them, don't look at them in the abstract, take them into the field. There are many learnings from them, starting with self-assessments. We rather get known at GSTC for the guidance we give on good certification, and that's important part of our work on guidance on third-party certification. But so much of the value of applying the GSTC criteria is simply starting with a self-assessment and doing a very tough love message for yourself, whether you're in the public sector managing destinations or setting public policy, or you're in industry. So let me just kind of take a few examples of some prominent elements of it, just to kind of give you a flavor of what I have in mind. When you look at the various elements of tourism that's coastal, we can start with beaches. So many people in tourism go to a beach, not just leisure, but MICE, retreats and companies and meetings and so forth. So there's a lot going on at beaches. We tend to think about plastics, and the GSTC criteria include waste management issues, and plastic reductions are very much there. But in my experience, when we go out into the field with destination management units and academics and anybody who's caring and paying attention to destination, we find in the field, by really looking criterion by criterion, there's some eye-opening things that happen. An example would be if you go to a busy bay or beach area where there's lots of jet skis and boats and paragliding and all that stuff, we might tend to first think about plastics, which we very well should. But when we point it out to public authorities and say, look, especially in developing countries that may not have proper marinas, modern facilities with docks and so forth, and you see some plastic barrels full of oil and fuel for all those boats, we just challenge people and just say, think about that manual distribution of that. If you don't have proper distribution, all those boats, somebody's carrying these big barrels out, the spillage is incredible. Nobody looks at that and nobody really thinks about that. But that's an example of when you take the criterion out in the field and say, let's look at all the aspects of cleanliness and pollution and so forth. There are some eye-opening experiences that happen, and that's a topic that I think we really need to be looking at. It's a lot of busy tourist areas that just, I don't hear that one really talked about, is the spillage and leaks from oil and gas and all that. Europe has a lot of blue flag labeled beaches. We'd love to see that spread around the world. Perhaps the signatory parties to the high-level ocean panel could do more encouragement and perhaps even regulation for beaches and marinas to follow something like Blue Flag or others that really specialize in that. We actually have kind of moved a little bit more in specialization with ports at GSTC, because even though we believe strongly that the GSTC destination criteria really speak to all types of destinations, we recognize that a cruise port has some special elements of it. So we've been working on an extension of the destination criteria for ports. And one of the interesting things there that is really a hot spot these days is port side electrification. When a cruise ship, large or small, comes into a port, they leave their engine running because they need to heat and cook and aircon and all that. The European Union now has a regulation that by 2030, all cruise ports must have installed facilities for the cruise ship to plug in, port side electrification. So just to think about all the different elements to that. If you plug in and you turn off the engine, you're reducing greenhouse gas emissions, you're reducing localized pollution in terms of the soot in the air and the noise, right? And electricity, of course, as we know, is getting cleaner than other forms of power. So that could be spread. Again, signatory parties to this panel could do what the European Union is doing, and maybe faster than 2030 would be a wise idea, because some of the cruise ships are retrofitting their ships, but only enough retrofitting of older ships to meet the need for the EU. So we need more ports in the world requiring them, so they don't just cluster those new ships and the retrofitted ships to sail in the Mediterranean and the Baltic. Let's get them in more parts of the world. So those issues kind of come out with use of it. Resorts, we do a lot of work on with industry criteria, many coastal resorts and so forth. One of the issues that we see come out that could gain more widespread understanding is that there's so many great examples of a hotel doing so many wonderful things. But I would argue that we're missing a lot on the fact that the big brands that have the biggest quantity of hotels in the world are on a franchise model. So whereas we're focused quite often on the fact that the big brands have these lovely internal programs for guidance to all their different properties, well, if those big brands, most of them own or manage 0% of their hotels, it's entirely up to the owner. We need to raise awareness. We need more regulation to push the ownership of each individual property to abide by the criteria and so forth. So those are just some of the kind of hotspots that I think by focusing on criterion by criterion, things get unearthed. And so I would issue this challenge to everyone is, again, don't think of standards and the GSTC criteria in the abstract, but get them in the field and do a tough love self-assessment as a starting point.
Thank you very much, Randy. Yeah, I think you're completely right. You learn and see so much more when you actually go to that beach or go to that port or go to that place and see what's actually happening. And interesting what you were saying about the port side electrification taking place in the EU. And I'll be really interesting to see what the practicalities are for rolling that out, especially to small island developing states and least developing countries, which maybe have different power challenges to be able to supply what a cruise ship needs. So it might take more time. So great. Thank you very much for sharing, Randy. Next, would like to warmly welcome Ruta Schalken, who is a senior sustainable tourism specialist with the Asian Development Bank. And Ruta has over 25 years experience leading multifaceted and complex projects, enterprises and diverse teams in the tourism market and operations. Welcome, Ruta. Ruta, may I ask you, please, what do you think development banks can do to ensure that investment is mobilized and prioritized for sustainable tourism ventures? And how can access to finance be made easier for those with good sustainability credentials and track records?
Thank you, Anna, and thanks to the Ocean Panel for allowing ADB to share its sort of interests and objectives and developments in this sphere. Maybe just a few words about ADB itself, because we are a bank, but we're not your classic high street bank. We're a development bank. There's a few others, good partners in the world. We're a solutions bank. It means we work across a variety of sectors and thematic areas. We do that geographically defined. We have 68 members across Asia. And our work very much consists not just in providing financing, but packaging that financing combined with knowledge, as well as with capacity building and advisory services. So it's that overall approach that's trying to find solutions that we also apply to this very urgent agenda of ocean health, under which, of course, the marine and coastal tourism initiatives fall. Now, we do that through a variety of opportunities, and all of it is driven by what our members, our destination, our development member countries are asking us to do. We do that working with governments directly, sort of the sovereign side of our operation, as well as the private sector side. And I think that already touches on some of the value that ADB and other development banks, like the African Development Bank, European Bank for Development Reconstruction, can bring to the table. It's that holistic approach. I think previous speakers and the introduction to the study made it very clear that there's no quick solution. It requires a variety of efforts, both in terms of physical investments in infrastructure, appropriate infrastructure, as well as investments into the regulatory requirements. Randy was just mentioning the need to put regulation into place. And through this combination of financing as well as policy advice, we can provide that lever. We have a variety of very technical tools for that. I won't go into too much detail, but they're kind of packaged either as policy-based lending opportunities, so we can provide appropriate financing to a specific country, to a specific destination, if they put certain regulatory measures into place. Now, all of those going forward need to be adhered to some of the larger objectives that ADB has assigned to, whether it's the Paris Agreement, a variety of agreements during the last rounds of COP. Even quite recently, I think plastics was mentioned as well, what was discussed in Uruguay. So our own internal systems kind of make sure that everything we do is aligned with, for example, the Paris Agreement, For the others, we're still working on the appropriate mechanisms and tools because it also needs to be measured and impacted. Now that's kind of the theory of things, but I think what we are extremely sort of proud of is the work we do in addressing the key bottlenecks of where the challenges occur. Asia is home to the biggest populations. It's also making the biggest negative contribution to the environment. But I think the recognition that even across Asia, more than 30% of the value of nations is derived from natural resources. So making sure that those are appropriately managed and utilized, not just for environmental concerns, but for economic, social well-being. I think that message is getting across, and we should pay credit to what a lot of the countries are putting into place in terms of improving their regulations in this space, their policy, and also appropriate investments in infrastructure. And I think the last question you raised about trying to incentivize good practice, maybe from tourism operators, I would like to counter that a little bit, because the good operators, and they know what they're doing, and it is very, very important to try and target that vast array of people who might be willing to do so but don't have the means for it. I think tourism across Asia, maybe globally, is coming at an age where we're also looking at a dated stock of tourism infrastructure, whether it's enterprises or whether it's more public space infrastructure like harbors. That needs to be updated to make sure it remains resilient. Now, resilience as a prerequisite for sustainability in this climate debate. And that is probably where the biggest challenge lies for a development partner like ADB and others, as well as the different countries and the private sector, to make sure that that dating stock that is there, and it's everywhere, from high-end Maldives resorts to Indonesian owner-operated hotels, Thailand, Vietnam, you name it, to make sure that that vast array of keys, very often the non-branded keys, also start contributing to the agenda that some of the industry leaders are putting into place. And I think that is kind of where probably more direct tools and opportunities need to be put into place. We've calculated that there's about 200 billion annually required to adjust the overall infrastructure requirements in terms of the climate agenda across Asia. So it's not just tourism, but that's money that we don't have, and there's not a single entity that has that. So it has to be pooled from public funds and from private funds. And there, I think, making sure that the right incentives are in place, that is something where a development bank can make the right contribution. We have some money available, and that some money available can make sure that some of the regulatory improvements are put into place that allows for private sector investments to come in, or testing things. I think we need to give credit to the private sector for being out there, trying to push the agenda for innovation, making sure that that can be replicated, that those lessons are also learned in areas where there's less accessibility to those good innovative approaches. That is a role that we can play to make sure that we try and bring everybody on board for that holistic approach. And that works regionally across borders. We're trying to really influence the world, but thank God we haven't managed to divert the currents in our oceans yet. So it's very much an international agenda, and I think you require an international partner to try and make a contribution to it. We can't resolve it all, but we have good designated tools available to try and make a contribution. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Uta. I think you're really right to reflect on what proportion of the industry is based on those natural resources and make sure that investment is protecting them. And that role of banks to get those incentives in place that encourage sustainable practices, and working with partners where money is not all in one pot, making sure there's so public-private partnerships, including across borders. So thank you very much indeed. And now I'm really delighted that Daryl Wade, who's the co-founder and chairman of Intrepid Travel, is with us. Daryl was the company's CEO for more than 20 years and is now the group's chairman. From day one, he has spearheaded Intrepid's journey to becoming a leader in sustainable, experience-rich travel. So Daryl, may I ask you, please? Intrepid has been a global leader in sustainable tourism practices, and particularly sharing knowledge on measuring climate impacts. What would you advise other operators working in the marine and coastal destinations to do differently in 2023? Thank you.
Thanks, Anna. Look, I think when we look at what operators should or shouldn't do, I think you've got to go back to first principles and really recognise that as travellers and as tour operators, we've got an incredible privilege to work in this space. You know, we're taking people to wonderful environments. People are enjoying themselves. As operators, we earn our living out of it. And so it's really an incredibly fortunate position to be in. And I think as a part of that, with good fortune comes great responsibility. And so I think it's really a case of we've got to be very cognizant of the pros and cons and the benefits and costs of our industry. And unfortunately, there are costs with travel and tourism. And as recent research from Oxford Economics and the WTTC found out, just over 8% of global carbon emissions are sourced from the travel and tourism industry. So that's something we as an industry just have to come to grips with. And I think, you know, we've known for quite a while that there's an issue there. And that kind of gets me to the second point, that we've got to move beyond conversations and talking about things and thinking about things and perhaps even, you know, doing a little bit of greenwashing. We've actually got to get down to solid actions. And it's all about actions because the time for talk is over. So I think in that context, tour operators have really got to get a much stronger grasp on what the impact of their operations are. And essentially that's around measuring their emissions in the context of climate change. And then once you measure those emissions, then set about a plan to decarbonise those emissions and hopefully do that in conjunctions with the Science Based Targets Initiative, which really puts the rigour behind the process. Now, for some tour operators, that's really tricky and hard, and they don't quite know where to start. And so a while ago, Intrepid, in conjunction with the Tourism Declares a Climate Emergency Initiative, which rolled into the Glasgow Declaration of COP26, we developed an open source carbon measurement blueprint. So any operator can go in, download this thing for free, I might add, and then work through what that means to them and actually get on the decarbonisation journey for themselves. And it's giving them a head start. So we hope that's helpful. Hundreds of companies now have already downloaded it, which is great. I think in addition to that, one of the greatest challenges around actions is the whole broader context of governance. There isn't those strong regulatory frameworks governing international waters and marine tourism. So tour operators, I think, really need to be helping to step up and create industry-wide responses. It's all very fine for companies like Intrepid and lots of individual other companies doing things, but really if we can align our interests and work on common platforms and standards, that really is helpful. Obviously, GSTC is absolutely critical. We heard from Randy before, you know, GSTC are the gold standards with this, but coming out of that, there's greater platforms. Things like Travelist are key, as is the WTTC, the World Travel and Tourism Council, which we're increasingly working on creating standards and platforms to really align interests and avoid duplication and get some effective results. Finally, I just want to talk a little bit about auditing. You know, every tour company audits their operations in a financial sense, not enough to do so in environmental sense and sustainability sense. And auditing is really where you can prove to yourself how you're actually going. And it's a really useful tool. And, you know, just give a small example in closing. As part of our auditing our operations, we realised that all our ships that go down to Antarctica, we used to give everyone a free fleece jacket so that they keep nice and warm. And they're quite an expensive thing. They're great jackets. They're nicely branded for the company. Everyone feels good about them. But the reality was, people took those jackets home and chucked them in a cupboard, and so it was just a wasted resource. And so we just thought, okay, people are already coming down with their own jackets, with their own clothes to keep warm. They're getting this extra thing. They're not necessarily using it, or they might use it on the ship and then they put it in their cupboard. Let's just stop it. We really need to reduce waste. And it's that kind of auditing and that understanding of customers that really understands where waste happens. And we're really just got to, each individual can look at their own operation. As Randy said, you've got to take your guidelines out, get into the field, see what's going on, talk to your customers, talk to your supply chain, and then start to actually work up the results individually as a result of that. So look, there's loads of things that tour operators can do on sustainability. You just got to make action start. Back to you.
Thank you very much, Daryl. Yeah, I think that making sure that the companies do their plans and take the action, I think you're absolutely right. That's the priority for the coming year. And really very interesting, that insight about the jackets of people going to Antarctica. And you would only get that if you had a very good rapport and discussion with your clients. I mean, if I went to Antarctica and I was coming back here to Papua New Guinea, mine would be in the cupboard too, because it's very hot here. We wouldn't need it. So that's really great. Thank you, Daryl. Okay, so thank you all very much, panelists. We've had one individual question each. Now, what I'd like to do is spend the next few minutes, about 15 minutes, with some general questions, which will be open to all of us to have a conversation with. Unfortunately, Randy's had to leave us as he has a scheduling conflict. So I hope the five of us can have a discussion. So may I ask, please, firstly, to the whole panel, what do you predict will be game changers for sustainable marine tourism in 2023 as the industry rebounds from COVID-19 while tackling the climate and biodiversity crises, coupled with the need to generate net benefits for local people? It's a big question with lots of things going on it. So the floor is open. Who would like to respond first to that?
Anna, in the absence of others, I'll just throw a curly one in from the edges. We're not specialists in marine environments as such, but I think one of the things that's coming from left field, which many people won't understand, is there's an emerging change to international accounting standards, which will be coming through. And that is going to impact every tour operator and everyone in the travel industry. And ESG criteria will be entering accounting standards before very long, and so everyone is going to be needing to manage supply chain issues and where their impacts are, carbon emissions, plastic, human rights issues, and all sorts of other issues. That's going to have really significant positive impacts to marine environments, and it's probably something that's not on many people's radars, but it's a great thing that's about to happen.
Thanks, Daryl. That's really, really important. It'll be interesting to see what Wouter has to say coming from the development banking side as well on that. So Russell, would you like to comment?
Yeah, I'd like to build on Daryl's comments that I'm coming more from the government side and working collaboratively with industry for many years, and a lot of that resonated. But what I'm hearing from some friends and colleagues in the reef tourism side is that the market is likely to be shifting. People are wanting a natural experience, a nature-based experience where they're welcome. They're not seen as destroying the planet by coming there and renting the charter yacht or whatever they do there. And with a different market, I just extend that idea of the accounting standards to the standards for disclosure, the TCFD, the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. There's an emerging standards for the financial impacts of nature-related financial disclosures. So I see a sort of a melding especially amongst the scientific community, of the climate crisis and the nature crisis, the biodiversity and extinctions and other things that are going on. So I see the different market needing a response. And my point would be, it can't come from one sector. It can't come from just the industry. There needs to be better, more productive partnerships with government, with community, with NGOs, and with Indigenous people in remote areas particularly. So to me, that's the challenge. It's starting to happen in different places. And I think that in Australia, we're seeing government's appetite for doing better with their environmental protection regulations and things is actually happening here now. So we'll see more of that. Thanks, Anna.
Thanks, Russell. Yeah, no, that collaboration and those partnerships are so important. And we've seen throughout COVID the growth of new partnerships and coalitions where people have been trying to resolve the problems that the tourism industry has had. So it'd be really good to see that moving forward. Is that Ruta? Yes, Ruta, would you like to comment, please?
If I may reflect on a game changer. Look, I also think that there's excellent progress being made, and it's also progress that is very visible. We have a lot of, especially on the operational side of tourism, a lot of firms doing really great initiatives that go far beyond what destination regulations requires. And I think that is pushing innovation, and that is really putting the benchmark to where it needs to go. But there is this large array of smaller firms, of lesser developed destinations, where impact might be as bad as in some of the other destinations, and we can't lose those. So trying to reach scale, I think, is important. And therefore, I think where Asia especially is still lacking a little bit is having these sort of clear economic user rights vested with coastal or marine affected communities. And that regulatory space is not in line with innovations that you find in Central America or in Africa, for that matter. So there's still quite a bit of work that needs to be done. And I think Russell gave a good example of appropriate management around the barrier reef and having the appropriate sort of structures in place to do that. And it's those management structures, ideally then incorporating a meaningful participation of local residents, of hosts in these destinations, that I think can be the big game changer going forward. We also shouldn't forget that there is, it's an industry that has really suffered. So there's not a lot of money available to really put more, let's say, environmental practices at operational level in place, and finding our efforts to try and support that through on-lending facilities, through commercial banks, for example, is also a huge discussion around risk. A lot of the destinations we work in have fear of clients defaulting on loans, especially after these very hard years, and the recovery efforts across Asia are not necessarily in par with the global trends yet. Hopefully with China opening up, we'll see some of that changing within the near future. But it's a delicate space, and within that delicate space, we have more ambitious targets that need to be met. And therefore, I think that space should also be used to make sure the right environmental regulatory environment is in place.
You can mute yourself.
Yeah,
sorry, Doug.
Just to go back on that, just from an industry perspective, one of my other hats is I'm a vice chair of the World Travel and Tourism Council, and about 6 or 7 weeks ago we had our annual conference, and so there's about 250 of the world's biggest travel company CEOs in the room. What was interesting there was what we just heard about, that vulnerability of the industry, I think was absolutely true 6 months ago, but it is not true today. The industry is extremely positive about the future. Booking levels have really bounced back massively. Confidence has bounced back massively. And so that's really giving executives that confidence to look forward. The other thing that I thought was interesting at that particular conference, for the first time ever, the number one issue on the CEO's talking points list was sustainability. Now, usually it's in the top 5 issues, along with, you know, employment options or supply chain issues or whatever. Sustainability was unquestionably the biggest issue in the room for 3 days. And I've just never seen that before. So just really encourage these panelists, but also the audience generally, to use that as a catalyst to really activate action, because it's I've not quite seen the level of positivity around taking action on not just climate change, but a broader suite of sustainability agenda items.
It's really great to hear, Daryl, that the momentum is there and it's at the top of the list rather than halfway down now. So really good to hear. I wanted to go back to something Wouter had said and request, maybe, if possible, if Mr. Ambassador, Dr. Ambassador, if you could respond, please. This issue about, you mentioned in your responses earlier about the tourism villages and how with the investment of $100,000 per village, you've had huge success. And just reflecting on that regulatory issues that Wouter mentioned, and also the innovation that's taken place. You know, what do you foresee for the next year for your tourism villages in the coastal areas? What is the next step for them? Is it working on the 20% that need some more help, or is it expanding further to more villages, or what are your plans?
Yeah, the idea is to expand to more areas, more villages, with the specific underlining of quality tourism and sustainable tourism. We have the industry is inviting us, actually, all the embassies and different tour operators in Europe and also in Germany particularly, to go either online or to visit the Bali tourism trade, specifically on the issue of quality tourism and on the sustainable tourism. We learn from this, you know, the great thing about this high-level panel is about the exchange of information. Last year, we had government regulations on the sustainable tourism. Of course, the definition of sustainable is a lot, but listening from many different colleagues in this high-level panel, we have now more or less a standard of what we call the Indonesian sustainable tourism. Is a guideline on that, and this goes across different type of tourism industries. But as we all understand, when it comes to sustainable tourism, you know, small villages, we need to do more. You know, we need to do more education. We need to do more communications. So that's why on the first issue of sustainable management, for instance, we really need to work with the local community. So we established a network of governments, local government especially, local community and private sector. So these are the 3 key when we talk about sustainable management of tourism in these villages. And
that's fantastic.
Yeah,
sorry.
And the central government, we are doing the monitoring, of course. Okay, and we are also, when we talk about private sectors, we bring the major private sectors on tourism, but we also want them to empower the local entrepreneurs. Okay, and different ministry, for instance, try to promote their product into the online streaming services. So if in some area, for instance, there's a village, I remember, a remote village in East Java, and the specialty of the people over there is to make this plastic bag from the plastic shampoo. So then we organize, you know, the collection system of the collections, and then the government start to buy the project for seminars, for conference kit and stuff like that, and then put on the internet. And then after a couple of months, they're just up and running by themselves. Okay, so this is a type of thing that we want to establish in terms of the empowerment of local entrepreneurship. And cultural sustainability is very important. We want to preserve the cultural heritage, because as you are well aware, in the different parts of Indonesia, our tourism is also about cultural heritage. If we're here in Germany, when I go to small villages, for the medieval villages, for instance, I try to learn something from the local government and share it to the ministry back to Indonesia. And of course, the environmental sustainability that we have mentioned over there. So these are the four pillars, I would say, when we talk about strengthening the villages and local economies, sustainable management, the social impact, cultural sustainability, and environmental sustainability. So we were initially, to be frank, a bit skeptical, because people say, well, you want to make this area touristic, then you have to build hotels, you have to build infrastructures. But no, apparently not, because in some places people just go for a day, to go there for culinary and they go back. And now we train them on the bed and breakfast, small rooms, bed and breakfast. So it's this kind of incremental project. So it's quite a journey, and I believe this will be expanded in the future.
Great. Well, I'm really looking forward to how it goes. I really like that wealth from waste kind of idea of making things from waste products. And again, coming back to that issue of partnerships, local government and community and the private sector working together. It's incredibly positive. Thank you very much. Okay, so we've got just over 10 minutes left in our session. So I'd really like to thank all the panelists for this really rich discussion. And now we'll move to the final part of our program, which is looking at some of the questions that have come from people who are joining us today from across the world. And so first, I'd like to go to a question which is for Russell from Hermione Neville. So Hermione asks, she says, thank you for sharing the very interesting information on the data between coastal actors and operators and marine management areas. So she asks, how does this work? What framework is used and what has been the operational experience, including any challenges? She says, you mentioned that operators can see their track their individual contributions to the whole. So she asks how this impact is attributed. And perhaps there's a document you can share.
Yeah,
so,
sure.
Wouter.
Wouter?
Sorry, Russell. I apologize.
No.
Sorry, Russell, question for you.
That's okay. I was waiting for Wouter's answer. Look, keep it brief. The real source of this information would be the website of the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park Authority. Am I on mute? No. And so so that's the answer to the last bit. The way it worked was that there was a lot of scientific work going on for decades with very sophisticated methods and monitoring systems that became more and more automated once underwater cameras and digitalization and remote sensing. Then we realized that the tourism industry really want to understand their site. So a new kind of measurement was designed so that the divers going to a site and doing a resort dive, a tourist dive, would be able to learn something in a 10-minute lecture that they could then do in the water, and that data would come back. And then what the government authority did was create a database that would incorporate it, summarize that information. But as it improved, Google Photo type way, they also allowed any tourist, any person, anywhere to upload a photo and then an AI approach to saying what that thing that they've seen. It could be a dolphin or a shark or a coral. And then eventually it got to be not just specialists like underwater experts moved to the tourist industry, and then the free independent travelers, someone sailing through there could take a photo and post it to this website and get a reasonable answer. The value to the authority was that they created a map which showed where all the protected areas were. And so it was a kind of a subtle way of telling them you're actually in a protected area now, as you can't fish or you can't do something, but it was done in a way that was a sharing of information. It's called Eye on the Reef, and the website of the Marine Park Authority. And I'm sure if you email them, they would respond with more technical information for Hermione Neville and people like Hermione.
Thank you very much, Russell, for clarifying that. That's really, really interesting innovation. So the next question from the participants, I'm going to direct to Daryl. So Daryl, Robert Brown is asking, is saying he has a particular interest in financing, and there was a mention of public-private partnerships, and he wonders if there's, sorry, I don't think this is a question for Daryl. Apologies, Daryl. I think this is actually a question for Wouter. Sorry, my sincere apologies. Wouter, on public-private partnerships, is there any other information on financing, on PPPs, and sources of reports and information that you could refer participants to?
Yes, I think specific for tourism, there's actually lots that has been written. I mean, PPPs in a variety of forms are an excellent tool for innovation, for conservation objectives. I'm just thinking about what the best way to get the right information across. I know, Anna, that you also you're well, I think, familiar with sources of information. I believe you did some work even with the World Bank, trying to compile a variety of those lessons. I very happily share what we have ourselves in this regard, but I know that others might be able to contribute to this as well.
Thank you, Wouter. Yes, and thank you. And actually, recently the World Bank has brought out a second edition of its Tools and Resources for Nature-Based Tourism, which has extra information on financing nature-based tourism sustainability ventures. So I will share the link with that for that report too. That just came out in December. Thank you. Okay, so there's a question for Daryl. It really is for Daryl this time, so apologies for Daryl. So David Fuller is asking, are there any technology solutions to be aware of? So sustainable materials, fuels, and monitoring things that can be used for audit purposes by companies that you're aware of?
There are various auditing tools doing it, and I know we at Intrepid have got a particular tool that we're now using in place that is fantastic, as it's distributed right through to on the ground. Our staff, in small villages and in remote areas and whatnot, can use it through an app-based tool, so you get that right in the field. And I can't remember the name of it now. I've mentioned it on, but more than welcome to contact me. But I suspect there's quite a number of tools now that really do facilitate that processing and the incorporation of data into your broader systems. So I don't think that's a major problem.
Thanks, Daryl. Yeah, I mean, you spoke earlier about the tourism declares a climate emergency and things. And I've been actually writing my report at the moment and trying to work out how much carbon I've been producing over the last year and my family and so on, so that we can reduce our emissions further. So it was really good to hear about those tools as well. Okay, so there's another question which I'd like to ask to the ambassador, which is coming from Nimel Pereira. And she asks, even though they're under serious economic crises conditions, there are still operators and hotels operating with high sustainability practices. So how do you see them getting high recognition in Indonesia and benefits and getting them to benefit over other non-sustainable operators? Mr. Ambassador. Sorry, would you like me to repeat?
Something is wrong with my connection. Could you please repeat?
Sorry, yes. The question coming from Nimel Pereira, she's saying that under the serious economic crises that operators are under, and there are still operators and hotels working with high sustainability practices, how do we get them higher recognition and business benefits over the other non-sustainable operators? So maybe you can reflect on the villages that you're working with, those that are more sustainable than others, how you can benefit them more, perhaps.
Yeah, we do it step by steps. Of course, we work on the standards, but we enforce them together with the different players. Because if you look at the structure of the tourism industry in Indonesia, of course you have the 5-star, the 4-star, the established hotels, but you also have then the independents who it's like the Airbnb type of things. And then in our case, we have the villages with the rooms in villages at the mountains, at the sea. So it is not very easy to begin with because we have to deal with so much, the myriad of different things. We do on both sides. We do on the customer side, for instance, and we do it also on the operator side. And we try to concentrate on 10 areas first, Anna. So just 10 specific areas in Indonesia, and then that 10 specific areas we work on every level of the tourism operators over there. So I think this is the strategy that we do. So it has to be step by step because financing issue, education issue, it's not very easy. But we have to have an incremental approach on this particular issue. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. In fact, thank you all very much. We've actually now reached the end of our time for discussion on opportunities for transforming coastal and marine tourism. So in closing, I would like to sincerely thank all of our panelists for joining us and for sharing their insights and experiences. I'd also like to thank all of the people joining us virtually from a multitude of countries today. And particularly thanks to Eliza Northrop, Claire Brennan and Charlotte Shep for all of their efforts to bring the Ocean Panel report and this event series to fruition. I'd like to encourage all of you to read the report and the expert perspectives on the Ocean Panel website and to reach out to us to engage further on these topics. As I mentioned earlier, the recording of this session and the slides will be shared with all of you. And you're also warmly invited to join the Tapas group to network with others who are working on these topics across the world. So thank you very much and goodbye.